Close your eyes, dear listener. Let the noise of the day melt away. Allow each breath to slow, like a soft breeze drifting through ancient ruins. Tonight we set sail to The Murder of Lord Darnley. The year was 1565, and Scotland trembled beneath the weight of storms both earthly and divine. At Holyrood, Mary Stuart, Mary, Queen of Scots, stood at the height of her youth and beauty. She had returned from France, widowed but not broken, and carried herself with the luminous grace of one whom poets likened to a flame in the darkness. It was said that the stars themselves shivered when Mary first laid eyes on Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. Tall, golden-haired, with the proud bearing of both Tudor and Stuart blood, Darnley seemed less man than sculpted marble come to life. Chroniclers recorded their meeting as fated, inevitable, though in the taverns and marketplaces, people whispered another tale.
An old crone in Edinburgh, famed for reading signs in the smoke of her hearth, claimed she saw two flames meet in the night sky. One bright and steady, the other dazzling but unstable, burning too fast, too hot. She told those who listened, "They shall burn together, aye, but one shall consume the other, and the ashes shall blacken all Scotland."
Mary ignored such omens. To her, Darnley seemed the answer to her restless heart and her political needs. His royal lineage, grandson of Margaret Tudor, sister to England's Henry VIII, made him both a lover and a weapon. With him, Mary might yet press her claim to the English throne, challenging Elizabeth Tudor, her cousin across the border. Their courtship was quick, passionate, and fiery. Songs were sung of their union, but in some darker halls, ballads twisted into warnings. A king by marriage, a queen by fire. Their bed of roses hides funeral pyre. Even before their wedding, the nobles muttered. They knew Darnley's charm was a mask for arrogance. He was vain, ambitious, and prone to drink, with a temper that flashed like steel in the sun. Some said he was beautiful only as Lucifer was beautiful, a light-bringer destined to fall. And so, when they were wed in July 1565, the sky over Edinburgh blazed red with sunset, though some swore it was more than the sun. They whispered of a comet that streaked across the heavens that night, and old men muttered of comets as omens of death. Mary, radiant in white and gold, placed her hand in Darnley's, never knowing she was clasping a hand that would one day claw desperately at the earth in its final hour. The weeks that followed the marriage revealed truths that courtly masks could not hide. Darnley demanded more than the role of king consort. He wanted sovereignty, the crown matrimonial, power equal to Mary's, the right to rule Scotland should she die. But Mary, wise in politics, refused. Their bond was passion, yes, but it was also a battlefield. His frustration grew, and so did his cruelty. He strutted about court as though already a monarch, flaunting his lineage, scoffing at nobles, demanding obedience. Those who had once marveled at his beauty now began to mutter words like arrogant, tyrant, and unworthy. Mary tried to soothe him. She gifted him fine clothes, jewels, titles, but still he sulked, drank, and schemed. Even as she carried his child, his eyes wandered to other women, and his ears bent toward conspirators. At night, when the palace grew still, the servants whispered of strange noises in the king's chambers. Moans, groans, and once a sound like scratching claws against stone. A maid swore she saw Darnley pacing, alone in candlelight, speaking not to himself, but to shadows that moved, though no man stood beside them. The priests dismissed such stories as gossip, but the people remembered the crone's prophecy, a flame too wild, too unstable.
Court was never free of intrigue, but in Mary's reign, masks upon masks multiplied. Nobles who had once feigned loyalty now circled like wolves, each with their own ambitions, each whispering against the other. Darnley, impatient and reckless, found himself both puppet and player. Some lured him with promises of power, others dangled secrets like bait. Mary's enemies saw his weakness and sought to use it to break her. But beneath the scheming of men, myths clung like cobwebs. Edinburgh was a city where every alley had a ghost, every hill a legend. At court they whispered of witches who foresaw blood upon the throne, of fairies who cursed royal marriages.
When a fox was found strangled in the gardens of Holyrood, the servants swore it was an omen. Foxes, they said, symbolized cunning betrayed, and when, one night, Mary dreamed of fire consuming her bed, she awoke to find Darnley standing over her, candle in hand, his eyes strangely vacant. She asked him what he was doing. He said nothing, only smiled and set the candle down. But Mary's ladies-in-leading noted how pale she looked the next morning, how tightly she held her rosary. The stage was set. History would remember the politics, the betrayals, the blood, but those who lived it whispered of something deeper, as if fate itself had turned against the queen and her golden consort, and shadows were already tightening their grip around Lord Darnley's throat. The air in Holyrood Palace was heavy that March of 1566, though not with weather alone. Whispers slid along the walls like smoke. David Rizzio, Mary's private secretary, her closest confidant, had risen too high, too fast. An Italian of humble birth, skilled in song and diplomacy, he had become her constant companion. He read her letters, played her music, comforted her in the long hours when her husband sulked and plotted. To the nobles of Scotland, it was intolerable. To Darnley, it was unbearable. Darnley had grown restless, his pride wounded by Mary's refusal to grant him the crown matrimonial. He was king in name only, a shadow beside his wife's radiant power. He turned his gaze on Rizzio. Rumors spread like fire that the Italian was too close to the queen, that her unborn child might even be his. No matter how baseless, the poison of gossip sank deep, and deeper still into Darnley's soul. He would walk the palace corridors, his boots striking hard against the stone, muttering curses. Servants swore he muttered in two voices, one his own, the other harsh and strange, echoing like a crow's croak. "She is mine," he was overheard saying, "and he will not steal her from me." Some claimed he took to visiting an astrologer in Edinburgh, demanding to know who fathered Mary's child, demanding to know if he would ever sit upon the throne as a true king. The astrologer, trembling, supposedly told him, "You will wear a crown of thorns, not of gold."
It was not Darnley alone who sought Rizzio's death. The Protestant lords, resentful of Mary's Catholic influence and jealous of Rizzio's sway, seized the opportunity. Together they wove a plan, a violent spectacle that would shatter Mary's heart and cement Darnley's loyalty to them.
They promised him the crown matrimonial if he would help. Darnley agreed, though whether from ambition, jealousy, or madness, no one could say. One account claims he signed the pact with them not in ink, but in blood, pricking his finger and letting it drip onto the parchment. Another whispers that in the chamber where they met, a candle guttered though no wind blew, and a rat ran across the floor, vanishing through the stones as if swallowed. On the night of March 9th, Mary dined with Rizzio and a few trusted companions in a small supper chamber. She was 6 months pregnant, her form heavy, her face pale but resolute. The room glowed with candlelight, soft against the wood-paneled walls. Outside, the wind moaned faintly, carrying the smell of rain. Rizzio, cheerful as always, strummed a lute and sang a light Italian song, trying to lift the queen's spirits. His voice was gentle, flowing, but in the corners of the room shadows seemed to ripple, as though listening with unseen ears. Then the door burst open. Darnley strode in, pale, his eyes gleaming with feverish light. Behind him thundered a company of armed men, Lords Ruthven, Morton, Lindsay, and others, steel flashing in the candlelight. Mary rose, startled, clutching her belly. Rizzio froze, the lute slipping from his hands. "What is this?" Mary demanded. "Why do you come armed into my chamber?" Ruthven, gaunt and sickly, his skin yellow from long illness, rasped, "We come for the Italian. He is no fit companion for a queen." What had followed was chaos, a storm of violence within that small chamber. Ruthven, too weak to fight, leaned against the door, his sword drawn. The others surged forward. Darnley seized Mary by the waist, pinning her back, his grip rough despite her cries. He held her fast while the assassins rushed upon Rizzio. The secretary cried out, clinging to Mary's skirts, begging for mercy. His eyes were wide, shining with terror. "Save me, madam, for the love of God!" But there was no saving him. Swords plunged into his body, once, twice, again and again. The sound of steel striking flesh echoed horribly in the chamber. He screamed, his voice ragged, then cut off. Dragged from the queen's side, he was stabbed 56 times, his lifeblood soaking the floor. His body was hauled into the next chamber, discarded like waste. Mary, trembling, shouted for them to stop, but Darnley's grip tightened. Some swore they saw his face twisted into something inhuman, his lips pulled back in a smile too wide, his eyes gleaming with hatred or madness. When it was done, silence fell, broken only by Mary's sobs and the rasping breaths of the conspirators. The room stank of blood, iron, and smoke. In that moment, Mary rose above fear. Her voice, sharp and terrible, filled the chamber. "You have slain him under my protection," she said, her eyes blazing. "And for this deed Scotland shall bleed, I swear it." Some who heard her said her words were not her own, but carried with them the weight of prophecy, as though the ancient spirits of Scotland spoke through her. Ruthven, weakened, staggered back, clutching his chest. Darnley released her, his face pale now, his arrogance crumbling. The queen's ladies rushed to her side, weeping, whispering prayers. Mary stood still, her hand on her womb, her eyes fixed on the corpse of her friend. Outside, the night howled with wind. Some swore they heard not wind, but laughter, thin, cruel, echoing across the stones of Holyrood. The murder of Rizzio shocked Scotland. The streets buzzed with rumour. Some said the devil himself had guided Darnley's hand.
Others whispered that the Fae had claimed Rizzio, jealous of his closeness to a queen of both mortal and royal blood. In taverns, ballads grew. By 50 blades the song was stilled, by jealous hand the chamber filled, but ghosts shall rise where blood was spilled. And rise they did, if tales be true. Servants later swore that at night, in the room where Rizzio was slain, they heard faint strains of music, a lute plucked by unseen hands. Others claimed to see a figure, pale and sorrowful, gliding through the halls, whispering Mary's name. As for Darnley, he had crossed a line from which he could not return. The murder bound him to the lords, but it also bound him to doom. For the blood of Rizzio would not be forgotten, nor forgiven. And in the eyes of his queen, he had transformed from consort to betrayer. Their marriage, once hailed as fire and light, now smouldered with ashes and shadows. The stage was set for the next act, and for Lord Darnley's own death, waiting in the darkness, like a noose around his neck.
The murder of David Rizzio stained Holyrood not only with blood, but with something darker, an invisible weight, like smoke that clung to every stone. Servants whispered that the palace itself seemed colder after that night, its halls longer, its shadows deeper. Mary, though wounded in spirit, endured, but Darnley changed. Some claimed he grew restless, more paranoid, as though he had seen death too closely and knew it was circling back for him. Others said he walked as a man already cursed. It was then, in the months after Rizzio's death, that the story of the alchemist's warning entered the chronicles of both history and legend.
In Edinburgh there dwelt, at that time, men of learning who dabbled in more than scripture and law, physicians who studied the stars, scholars who brewed potions from mercury and sulfur, alchemists who promised wisdom but often delivered fear. One such figure was said to be Alexander Seton, a man whose name would later be wrapped in legend as the Wizard Earl. Whether he was truly present in Darnley's life, or whether the tale was spun later, no one can say, but the story persisted. Darnley, gnawed by guilt and ambition, sought counsel in secret. Disguised in a dark cloak, he slipped from the palace by night, riding down narrow wynds where lanterns burned low. He came to a chamber lined with jars and crucibles, the air thick with the tang of metals and herbs. The alchemist, thin, pale, his eyes reflecting candlelight like a cat's, greeted him without bowing. "You come not as king, but as a supplicant," the man said. Darnley demanded answers. Would he gain the crown matrimonial? Would he live to see his son born? Would Mary's love return to him? The alchemist said nothing. Instead, he poured powders into a brass basin and lit them with a coal. Smoke rose, twisting, forming shapes that quivered like living things. Darnley leaned forward, his face lit by the red glow. In the smoke, he saw himself, not crowned in gold, but strangled, his tongue lolling, his eyes bulging. Around his neck a rope, around his body flames. He recoiled, cursing. "A trick," he shouted, "a lie." But the alchemist only raised a hand. "The stars do not lie, nor does smoke. Your crown is ash, Henry Stuart, and ash you shall become."
The scholar went on, his voice low, as though reciting from some ancient text. "You are marked by 4 deaths, my lord. Hear me well.
By air, for breath shall fail you. By earth, for soil shall cover you. By fire, for flame shall seek you. By water, for Scotland weeps in blood. Darnley trembled. Some say he spat at the man and stormed out. Others whisper he fell to his knees, begging for a way to break the curse. But the alchemist only turned back to his crucibles, muttering, "A flame too wild cannot be tamed. It must burn and burn out." Word of this secret meeting somehow seeped back into court. Perhaps a servant spoke, or perhaps Mary herself heard whispers of it. In later tales, she confronted Darnley. "You consort with sorcerers now, my lord." To which he replied, pale and shaken, "Better a sorcerer's words than the silence of a wife who loves me not." Mary turned from him, her hand resting protectively on her belly. Whatever passed between them, it deepened the gulf that already yawned wide. And so rumors spread, embroidered by imagination, that Darnley had bargained with demons, that he carried a talisman under his doublet, a charm of lead inscribed with Latin words, and that on some nights he woke screaming, his hands clawing at his throat as though unseen fingers strangled him in his sleep.
It was not only Darnley who was haunted. Mary, too, was visited by dreams. One night she dreamed of walking through Kirk o' Field, though she had never yet set foot there. The ruined church loomed, its stones blackened, its air heavy with damp. She saw her husband lying on the ground, his body broken, his face blue, his lips parted as though whispering her name. Behind him rose not men, but shadows, long, twisted, faceless, who laughed in voices like wind through reeds. Mary awoke in terror, clutching her womb, whispering prayers. But she told no one, for in dreams she felt the line between prophecy and madness was too thin to cross aloud. Whether true or invention, the tale of the alchemist's prophecy became part of Scotland's folklore. Old women told it by firesides, how Lord Darnley was shown his death before it came, and how he ignored it. Street ballads mocked him as a man cursed by elements. One fragment, preserved in oral tradition, sang, quote, "Smoke did show him strangled breath, earth did mark his early death, fire did roar, and water wept. Thus the doomed Lord's soul was kept." To the people, it was proof that his fate was not mere murder, but destiny, that Darnley was bound from the first to meet his end not by man's will alone, but by the hand of something greater, curse, star, or God. By the end of 1566, Darnley was a man unraveling. He feared poison in his wine, daggers in the dark. He carried pistols at his side, muttering that every shadow was an assassin. And yet, in cruel irony, he still dreamed of power, still demanded the crown matrimonial, still sought to bend Mary to his will. But the queen no longer looked on him with love. To her, he was no longer flame, but smoke choking her breath. Behind the veil of politics, behind the anger of nobles and the jealousy of husbands, something else seemed to stir, a sense of inevitability, that the alchemist's words, whether true or false, had set events on an unalterable path. And at the end of that path, waiting in silence, was Kirk o' Field. The corridors of Holyrood Palace had grown colder still, the echoes of Rizzio's murder lingering like smoke that refused to dissipate. Darnley's once proud posture now seemed stiff, forced, his confidence waning even as his ambition burned hotter. He was a man straddling two worlds, the tangible, brutal court politics of Scotland, and a shadowed realm where prophecy, superstition, and the whispers of the dead held sway. By autumn of 1566, the palace was a hive of conspiracies. Lords, both Catholic and Protestant, plotted openly and in secret. Mary, aware of their schemes, navigated the perilous terrain with grace and caution, yet even she could not fully contain the rising storm. Lord Lennox, Darnley's own father, had returned from exile in England, weary of his son's arrogance. He was cautious, wary of the volatile mix of ambition and jealousy that marked Darnley's character. Yet the young man was stubborn, demanding, and careless with alliances. He sought counsel in men who were not always wise and trusted those whose loyalty was bought in gold, not honor. Meanwhile, the lords who had orchestrated Rizzio's murder began to press Darnley further, subtly steering him toward actions that would undermine Mary's authority. Ruthven, Morton, and Lindsay whispered in his ear, each word designed to sharpen his paranoia and feed his insecurities. Some nights, servants swore they heard Darnley pacing in his chamber, muttering in tongues learned from the alchemist, or perhaps whispered by spirits. A candle flickered and went out when he raised his hand, as if the room itself resisted his presence. Mary, attuned to both politics and the subtle currents of magic that clung to her court, sensed the tightening noose. She noticed the way Darnley's eyes darted toward every shadow, the way he flinched at sudden sounds, and how he lingered too long in conversation with certain nobles. Her dreams grew darker. In one, the queen saw a great tree bending beneath the wind, its branches entwined with ropes, its roots submerged in dark water. Beneath it, a golden-haired figure lay prone, bound by invisible hands. She awoke with sweat-drenched sheets, her heart pounding. She began speaking more frequently to her advisors, requesting guards at odd hours, and even consulting the old crone who had once predicted fire and ash in her union. The crone's reply was chilling. The flame burns, but the smoke will strangle him. He walks in circles of his own doom. Legends tell that Kirk Field, where Darnley would ultimately meet his end, was a place not just of earthly walls and stones, but of ancient power. It was said that fey courts lingered beneath its soil, that spirits of the dead whispered through the trees, and that those who entered with ill intent would feel their breath on the back of the neck. Darnley, however, dismissed such stories as superstition. He laughed at the whispers, even as they gnawed at the edges of his mind. The servants, however, whispered differently. They spoke of seeing a pale figure standing near windows at night, of hearing a voice that echoed Darnley's own, repeating his fears. Some chroniclers suggest that Darnley's arrogance blinded him to the reality of the danger around him. Others claim the Fae themselves conspired, weaving fate and destiny into the mortal realm to correct the balance.
In the shadows, letters flew between the lords and foreign powers. England's Elizabeth, cautious but curious, kept her distance, watching the instability unfold like a hawk circling its prey. Meanwhile, French envoys reported on Mary's diminishing authority and Darnley's erratic behavior. Darnley, seeking validation and allies, corresponded with these powers, showing both ambition and desperation. He boasted in one letter that soon he would command Scotland as sovereign, yet in another he confided his fear that the lords plotted his downfall. The tension grew unbearable. Each nobleman's word was both a promise and a threat. Each candlelit corridor could hide a dagger. And all the while, the prophecy of the alchemist, whispered warnings of elemental death, hovered unseen above him. Mary, aware of the Lord's manipulations, began to act with calculated subtlety. She feigned ignorance of Darnley's dealings, even as she positioned herself to protect her unborn child. She strengthened her alliances with loyal nobles, signaling both power and restraint. Yet she also began to test Darnley, observing his reactions to subtle provocations. Did he panic when whispered rumors of conspiracies reached him? Did he lash out at those loyal to her? The Queen's gaze, often serene, now carried a sharp edge of caution, as if seeing more than the eyes could perceive. Mary knew that in Scotland, love and death were often intertwined. Her heart, once filled with passion for her golden consort, now carried both fear and a wary strategy. She could not yet stop the storm, but she could observe it, study it, and prepare.
By winter, the signs of doom multiplied. Horses balked in stables, refusing to move as though sensing something invisible. Fires in hearths danced strangely, sending shadows that writhed unnaturally across walls. Servants swore they heard footsteps in empty corridors and whispers of names spoken backward. Darnley, increasingly isolated, sought the comfort of liquor and companionship, yet his court was thinning, his allies few and fickle. Even his closest confidants began to fear the storm he was stirring, both politically and spiritually. One night, Mary awoke to find Darnley standing at her window, staring out into the blackness. His face was pale, and his voice, when he spoke, was trembling. "I feel them, Mary. I feel the Lord's, and something else. Something watching, waiting. I do not wish to die." Mary, whose own dreams had already warned her, could say nothing, for her heart knew what was to come, yet even prophecy cannot halt ambition and betrayal. By early 1567, Darnley was lodged at Kirklefield, recovering from an illness that had left him weakened and vulnerable. The house was comfortable, but isolated, surrounded by open orchards and darkened lanes. It was a perfect location for a conspiracy. The Lords, with Darnley's own complicity, plotted what would become one of Scotland's most infamous crimes. Each night, as the wind carried through the trees, whispers told of ropes, gunpowder, and shadows gathering, unseen but inevitable. Legends say that even the trees in the orchard bent toward the house, as if warning the world that something wicked was imminent. Some claim that a shadow, neither man nor animal, circled the house at night, watching, waiting, ensuring that prophecy and politics would converge in blood. And so the web tightened. Darnley's pride, fear, and ambition drew him closer to his fate. The Lord's schemes advanced with precision. The spirits, fae, and elements that had whispered warnings seemed now to lean forward, eager for the final act. The stage was set for the night that would shake Scotland to its core, a night where history and myth would merge in flame and blood. The winter of 1567 was bitter. Snow lay thick over Edinburgh, yet Kirklefield stood isolated, its stone walls cold and foreboding. The house was modest, its rooms comfortable but exposed, surrounded by orchards that stretched into shadowed fields. Here, Lord Darnley, once tall and proud, now lay weakened by illness, arrogance, and fear. Inside, the chambers were quiet. Candlelight flickered on the walls, shadows dancing like restless spirits. Servants had been reduced to a skeleton staff, enough to maintain the household, but too few to prevent a threat. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and dried herbs, yet an undercurrent of something darker lingered, an invisible tension that pressed against the walls like hands unseen. Darnley had demanded isolation, convinced that enemies lurked in every shadow. And he was right. The lords who had plotted Rizzio's death were now poised to strike again. Their plans had been laid carefully. Gunpowder had been smuggled into the house under the cover of night, hidden beneath barrels and crates. Sentries watched silently from the edges of the orchards, ensuring that no one would interfere. Yet there was more than human planning at work. Legends tell of the Fae, angered by Darnley's arrogance and by the blood spilled at Holyrood. They whispered through the trees, their voices riding the winter wind, urging the conspirators forward, ensuring that every misstep and hesitation of man aligned with fate. Even the stars, pale and distant in the clear winter sky, seemed to shiver, signaling a night that would be remembered for centuries.
The young lord sat in the great chamber, sipping weak wine, his golden hair tousled from illness. He laughed at small jokes from a companion, but there was a tremor in his hands, a hollowness behind his eyes. He spoke of dreams, strange dreams of ropes, of falling, of flames and water, but no one listened. He complained that the walls seemed to breathe, that shadows lingered where they should not. His companion, uneasy, reassured him. "You are ill, my lord. Your imagination wearies you." Yet even as he drank, Darnley did not notice the subtle signs. A candle guttering, though no wind blew. A shadow at the edge of the doorway that did not belong to any man. And a whisper carried on the wind, soft and mocking, repeating his name. By nightfall, he retired to a small bedchamber, exhausted, unaware that the web of betrayal was closing. At midnight, the night was shattered. A deafening roar tore through the silence. The walls of Kirko Field trembled, smoke and fire bursting outward. Timber and stone flew into the darkened sky, showering the orchard with splinters. Horses whinnied in terror, echoing across the fields. Yet when the neighbors rushed to the scene, they found something more horrific than the explosion itself. Darnley's body was not in the rubble. He had been strangled so efficiently that some believed the hand of fate or some darker force had ensured he would not escape. The explosion, it seemed, was a stage, a spectacle to mask the true murder. Gunpowder had ignited, yes, but the man himself had been removed first. Witnesses swore the air smelled not only of sulfur and smoke, but of decay, a stench that clung to memory and lingered for weeks. The orchard was eerily quiet, save for the occasional whispering wind, which sounded almost like laughter.
From that night forward, stories grew as rapidly as the snow melted in spring. Some claimed Darnley's ghost walked the orchard, golden hair streaked with ash, eyes wide and unblinking, lips mouthing curses against the conspirators. Others spoke of shadows that moved independently of the flickering torchlight, figures that could not be accounted for by men or animals. Even in the city, tales circulated. A man seen in the distance, pale and ethereal, wandering the streets, muttering, I am strangled, yet I rise. And the Fae, whose presence had long been whispered in courtly circles, were said to have taken an interest. Some claimed that the very earth of Kirkefield had trembled beneath their power, ensuring that no plot would remain hidden, and that vengeance, in some form, would inevitably follow. Mary, upon hearing of the explosion, rushed to the scene, her heart torn between fear and disbelief. She arrived to find the house partially collapsed, walls blackened, the orchard littered with timber and broken glass. Darnley's body, lying in the orchard with rope marks upon his neck, confirmed her deepest dread. The queen wept, but not entirely from sorrow. Some chroniclers say that her grief was mixed with horror, anger, and a quiet, terrible understanding that the hands of men, and perhaps something beyond men, had conspired to make history out of tragedy. She turned her eyes upon the lords. Ruthven, Morton, and others cowered under her gaze, for the queen's presence carried both royal authority and the unspoken power of prophecy. Mary swore that Scotland would remember this night, that the blood spilled at Kirkefield would stain not only the earth, but the hearts of all who conspired.
In the weeks that followed, the explosion became legend. Ballads were sung, telling of a golden-haired lord betrayed by ambition and darkness. Children whispered tales of a ghost walking the orchard, a spirit of both beauty and terror who cursed those who looked upon him. Some historians noted that the death of Darnley destabilized Scotland, emboldening rivals and weakening Mary's claim to the throne. Yet the myths endured, painting the event with colors no chronicler could capture: fire and shadow, treachery and fate, mortality and the supernatural intertwined. Even centuries later, travelers who walked the orchard at night swore they felt a presence, a hand on their shoulder, a whisper in the wind, a flame flickering in the snow. And some muttered that the house, though gone, still lived in spirit, a monument to betrayal, ambition, and prophecy. Thus ended the life of Lord Darnley, not merely a victim of politics, but a figure enmeshed in myth. His death was more than murder. It became a story, a warning, a curse whispered through generations. Mary's grief was profound. Her political position weakened, yet her resolve remained. She had seen the shadowed threads of fate weave around her consort, and she knew that even in death, Darnley's story would haunt Scotland. The House of Doom had fulfilled its role. The explosion marked not only the end of a man, but the convergence of history and legend. A story to be told, retold, and remembered as long as the winds whispered through the orchards and the shadows lingered where men feared to tread. The orchard of Kirkefield lay silent in the cold light of dawn. Snow had begun to melt, revealing patches of earth blackened by fire, and the splintered remains of the house stood as a ruinous monument to ambition and betrayal. Yet silence did not mean peace. The crows had arrived. Black wings cut the pale morning sky, circling above the orchard where Lord Darnley's body had been found. Farmers in the distance whispered that the birds were omens, that wherever they gathered, death had recently walked. They were right. Mary, Queen of Scots, arrived once more, escorted by loyal nobles who had not conspired in Darnley's death. She moved slowly through the ruins, her gown dragging through the snow. Her hand rested protectively on her unborn child, for she knew that in her womb lay both the promise of the future and the burden of history. She knelt beside the body of her husband, studying the marks on his neck. Her eyes, usually radiant, were dull with sorrow and fury. She whispered prayers in Latin, in Scots, in the languages of her ancestors, beseeching God, spirits, and whatever powers might listen to deliver justice. Yet she did not weep openly. Mary had learned that grief alone could not protect a throne. Only wisdom, patience, and an understanding of the forces, human and supernatural, that moved through her kingdom could do that.
Legends tell that on that day the orchard was alive with more than crows. Shadows moved against the snow, twisted and pale, some said bearing the faces of the lords who had plotted Darnley's death. Whispers carried through the trees, voices speaking in strange tongues, repeating Darnley's name, accusing, condemning. Some servants claimed to see Rizzio's ghost appear at the edge of the orchard, his hands stained with blood that would never wash clean. He seemed to hover, watching, listening, ensuring that no betrayal went unpunished. Even Darnley's spirit, golden hair now dulled by death, was said to linger. Some who approached the site reported a faint warmth in the air, a whisper of wind brushing against the cheek like a human hand, and a voice that trembled between fear and accusation. Betrayed. Betrayed. The lords who had orchestrated the murder were not spared by history. Morton, Ruthven, and Lindsay found themselves ensnared in political retaliation, suspicion, and eventual exile or execution. Scotland remembered betrayal, and the ghost of Darnley, whether real or imagined, became a symbol of the consequences of ambition and cruelty. Mary herself faced scrutiny. Rumors circulated that she had been complicit, that her silence made her guilty. Yet the Queen knew the truth. She had been both victim and observer. Her heart broken, her throne imperiled, caught in a web of ambition spun by men who underestimated both her resolve and the power of destiny.
Over the years, tales of Kirk-a-Field grew. Ballads sung of the golden-haired lord, strangled yet remembered, of crows that never left and shadows that whispered warnings. Parents told their children of the orchard, of how ambition could lead to ruin, and how even the mightiest could not escape the hands of fate. Travelers who dared to cross the site at night swore they heard footsteps in the snow, voices carried by the wind, and sometimes a faint song, Italian in origin, drifting through the air, the voice of David Rizzio, forever mourning, forever present. And in these tales, Darnley's murder was never just a historical event. It became legend. Myth and history intertwined, teaching that the consequences of pride, betrayal, and ambition extend beyond life, echoing through time. Mary left Kirk-a-Field with her child James, the future James VI of Scotland and I of England. She carried the weight of history and myth alike. Every decision she made afterward was shadowed by the memory of Darnley, of Rizzio, and of the whispers that haunted the orchard. She knew that in ruling she had to navigate not only men's ambition, but the unseen currents of fate. And so she became a queen of strategy, vision, and resilience, though her life remained tragic, filled with exile, imprisonment, and the relentless gaze of history. The people remembered the queen who survived treachery, but also the consort who died under shadows, in fire, in whispering winds. Kirk-a-Field became a symbol, a reminder that in Scotland, history and myth walk together, and that even in death, the story of a man can shape the destiny of a nation. The crows continued to gather over the orchard for years afterward, their black wings a living testament to betrayal and blood. Scholars, storytellers, and travelers alike noted the uncanny stillness of the place, the strange temperature in winter, the whispers in the wind. Some said the Fae had claimed the orchard as their own, ensuring that no one would forget the price of ambition. Others believed it was divine justice, the natural order asserting itself over human greed. And perhaps both were true. Perhaps history had always been inseparable from myth. Long after the stones of Kirk O'Field crumbled, the story endured. The murder of Lord Darnley was remembered not only in chronicles, but in whispers, shadows, and the cawing of crows, a tale where blood and destiny, ambition and betrayal, life and legend all converged into one eternal night.